Hey, welcome back again to the Ivory Tower Collections. I got another tech video that we're going to do today. I'm going to show you, but let's just kind of get right to it. So what I have is I've got a system that's been sent to me to be modified in a number of ways, and that would be this wonderful Sega Genesis right here. The purpose of what I'm going to show in this video is I'm going to show you the audio modifications that have been requested that I'm going to make to this Genesis. Those modifications are these two things right here. This is the new M1 Mini Mega audio bypass amplifier and mixer, and this is the M1 Double Mega. Both of these boards are created by FirebrandX. He's quite prevalent on the Sega 16 forums. The purpose of these two boards is basically for audio related modifications. Let's talk about the M1 Mini Mega first. Here's the M1 Mini Mega. This is basically, to sum it up, as close as we can get to the crystal clear audio mod designed specifically for Model 1 Sega Genesis systems. Now the Model 2 and the Model 1 VA7 already have their own variants of a crystal clear audio mod. I do want to make quick note that these modifications are specifically for a Genesis Model 1, and if you're not sure what that looks like, this is typically a Model 1 Genesis. But this particular modification is only for the VA6 and below type variants of the Model Genesis. I believe the 6.5 or the 6.8 it is, are also good to go. Basically, they have to contain discrete YM2612 synthesizer chips. A number of ways to be able to tell this, but pretty much the easiest way is just to look at the back of the console, and I'll see if I can bring it up and if my camera will zoom in again. There we go. Take a look at the back of the console. If it contains the expansion port, you're pretty much good to go. That's a guarantee that it's at least a VA6 or below. If the expansion port is not present, then take note of where the power plug is located. If the power plug is actually shifted over by about a ½ inch and is more along the lines of where the AV connector is and everything else is shifted over, that is a VA7, and this modification and video that I'm going to show you will not work for that unit. It's just not designed for it. Additionally, it's not designed for the Model 2 Sega Genesis either. So with that, let's get started. Tools that you're going to need. Well, you're always going to need a couple of stapled items. You're always going to need that number 2 Phillips. That's pretty much a given. You're going to need a set of like some needle nose pliers. I actually use a couple of different kinds. It just depends on what's going on and what I might need. You're going to need a set of flush cutters or diagonal cutters, depending on your terminology. You're going to need a set of wire cutters. Any kind will do, whatever ones you're more comfortable with using. You might also want to use something like a Sharpie of some sort. I have a silver one that I've been using a lot on PCBs because it shows up really well on the green surface. I use this to mark polarity or to mark wire locations so that once I've found them I can make a quick dot next to it or something and then not have to search the board all over again looking for it. So kind of an optional thing, whatever you want to do there. A decent set of electrical tweezers, you know, whatever your preference might be there. Obviously you're going to need you know, your soldering iron, and in this case I'm going to be using my Heco FR300 desoldering station as well. And then, of course, you're going to need possibly like a reaming bit tool. I get this with my, I've got like a little soldering kit that comes with a couple of different tools. And I use this one quite a bit to help get some additional bits of solder out of the via holes if they don't always get sucked up properly. So this works good for getting that out of there. And then you're also going to need wire. What kind of wire you use is really up to you. It's up to personal preference. The kit, when you order the M1 Mini Mega from FirebrandX, he's actually going to provide you with some wire in the kit. In fact, it might be wired just like this, if I'm not mistaken. But really, you can use whatever you want. The only recommendation I have that not everyone does, or at least doesn't provide, is I would recommend that in the case of your power and ground wires, that you use a thicker gauge wire for that. Not too much thicker, but certainly thicker than the normal hookup wires that you're going to get in the kit. I'm not saying that the wires in the kit won't provide you with the connections you need for power and ground. They will just fine. But I've just always, just personal preference, I just always like to use a thicker gauge wire. But really you can use whatever you want. Again, it's personal preference. Other things you might want that are basically optional. In this particular installation, just because I think it's a good idea anytime that you add additional components to something that weren't already there, these are by no means required, but again, I kind of recommend it. And that is, and I'm going to be replacing both of the default voltage regulators, the two 7805s that come standard in a Genesis. They're going to be replaced out with some 2 amp output higher capacity versions. Basically, these are able to take in a little more voltage. Not that that's an issue with the Genesis, but what they also do is they provide up to 2 amps of current on the 5-volt rails, so that there's plenty of current and juice for all the components inside the system, and nothing gets starved voltage-wise. So always a good idea, I think, in this case, to change them out. Again, all these components are rather old. Additionally, if it hasn't been done, I would highly advise you to go ahead and recap a Sega Genesis that you might be doing this with. You're already going to have it open anyway, so it's just a good idea. Okay, so that's all of that out of the way. I'm going to go ahead and get this cleared off a bit and break down this Sega Genesis. So I've just completed replacing all of the capacitors on this board, and the reason for that is because, again, this particular Genesis is getting a lot of work done to it, but the primary focus of this video is to just discuss the installation of the M1 Double Mega audio amplifier board. So if we take a look at this board real quick, which I have it sitting right here, it's pretty small. Where do you want to install this? Actually, there's all sorts of places on this, at least on this particular Genesis, where we can install this. It's small enough that, you know, we could install it by simply maybe double-side sticky taping it to any of the larger ICs that are located on the board. If you do that, I would not tape it down to the Z80, and I would avoid not putting it on the 68K itself, the Motorola CPU. Those tend to get pretty warm, especially when the system's been on for a while. But that, because of its size, there's also lots of places we can install it on the board itself or just put it down. In fact, it would fit pretty decently, just about. In fact, that's pretty much dead on right there. It would fit. If you wanted, you could fit it right here between the VDP and this other chip over here. Or we could maybe fit it down right here next to the system memory in the Z80. That could work. So there's any number of places. So you need to decide where you want the board to go. One of the best locations to put it, and FirebrandX actually recommends this as well in his instructions that he has for this, is right up in here, in this spot here, where the 2612 is and the VDP. There's a pretty decent empty space here that he pretty much designed the M1 Double Mega, or I'm sorry, not the M1 Double Mega, but the M1 Mini Mega. He pretty much designed it to just fit perfectly into that space as well, just like that. And that's where I am going to install this one also. Like I said, I just replaced all the capacitors. Some of the capacitors actually have to be removed for this installation, and that's really the first step we need to do, is we need to remove this the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 audio line filter capacitors that exist right here, just off of the power switch between basically the Zilog or the Z80 and the power switch, and just below the 2612 synthesizer. That's because these filter capacitors are what tie all of the different audio inputs from not only the FM side, but also the PSG, the 32X, and the Sega CD. This is what ties all of those through the filtering and amplification over here. And we're basically going to be bypassing all of that. We're not going to need it anymore. So as a result of this, to get the cleanest unfiltered sound you can through this little guy, which is what is recommended to do, we're going to be removing these 7 input capacitors right here. And you may notice, I don't know how well it'll show up in the video, but when I replaced all the capacitors, you'll see that these capacitors are actually standing up really tall on the board. I did that on purpose, and I'll explain why real quick. Normally, I would never do that. But because I knew that these capacitors have to be removed I wanted to make sure the system worked after I replaced all the capacitors. I didn't want to just replace them and then just assume everything would be good to go. So what I did as a temporary measure was I just quickly solder tacked in these 7 filter capacitors that I would need just to simply test this Genesis out and do a quick burn in, make sure everything was going to be good to go before I proceed with the rest of the upgrade and installation on this. So that's what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to go ahead and desolder these capacitors. Normally I would need to use my desoldering iron to remove these, but because I just sort of tacked these on there from on top, all I'm going to need to do is just need to use my regular soldering iron to remove them off of here. But do keep in mind, normally I would have used my desoldering iron to remove those capacitors. So yeah, I'm just going to remove these real quick and we'll be right back. Okay, I've now removed the 7 input line capacitors from the various audio components to separate them out from the onboard audio amplifier. And again, that is because we will be installing the M1 Mini Mega audio amplifier and mixer on the system to replace all of that. So the next thing we need to do is to go ahead and give ourselves some room to be able to work, and that's going to require having to remove the original heatsink assembly here. Now I've already removed the 2 anchor screws that held the main system board to the bottom shell. What I need to do to remove the rest of the heatsink assembly is to unscrew the anchor screws for the actual voltage regulators themselves. So I got to loosen those 2 screws, and then the other thing you have to do is you have to loosen and remove the 2 other additional anchor screws that are on the bottom side of the main board, also holding down the heatsink assembly. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of those. Just like that. Now, we removed that heatsink assembly to give us more room to be able to work with this, and that's because part of this, again, is going to require physically placing the M1 Mini Mega board where it needs to sit, or where we want to put it, in this case, on the main board. And also because we're going to have to wire up quite a few wiring connections from these input filter capacitor locations, specifically where the audio input lines would have gone into the filter capacitors. We're going to be wiring those up to the various points necessary here on the M1 Mini Mega board. And then from there, really all you'd have to do is you run your audio output wires from this side out to the RCA jacks. So really, that's the basic installation of what we're going to have to do. This video is only going to really cover the installation portion of just the M1 Mini Mega, because as far as how you route the audio, that's really a personal preference. I usually tend to install RCA jacks on the back of the Genesis to actually route external audio to, but it is also entirely possible, if you wanted to, you could actually remove the headphone jack wiring here, and then you could actually run your output wires straight to the old headphone jack. And Firebrand's instructions go through that process as far as which pins are which if you wish to use the actual headphone adapter. And one thing that I will mention is that when you order the kit from FirebrandX, he always provides these very high quality RCA jacks. They're audiophile professional grade RCA jacks. They are gold plated, but what I really like about them is they have the different like these different colored Teflon washers on them that not only hold the jacks in place, but they're also already color coded in addition to the very insides of the jacks themselves. So these are really cool. I really like these a lot. They do take up a little bit more space than your standard cheaper nickel plated RCA jacks would. But you know, if you're going to spend the money to have this done right and to order up one of these M1 Mini Mega audio amps, you're going to want to get the best possible sound that you want. And the whole thing is a premium product to begin with, so why not make it look the part, right? So what's the next step from here? Well, again, I had mentioned previously, the next step from here is that we need to run separate wiring from the audio input lines that used to go to the filter capacitors along here. It'd be better if I use something to sort of point with, I guess, along here, and they get routed to the various input locations and pads here. This particular client is having one more additional step done in their upgrade process. I already have a video that details this next part, so it won't be covered in this video, but I do want to mention it because it's important and is somewhat related to the installation of the M1 Mini Mega. This customer is also requesting to have an M1 Double Mega installed, which is the board that allows the use of the 2612 and the 3438 synthesizer chips with a toggle switch between them to be able to flip between which synthesizer you want active at any given time. The reason why I am bringing this up is because normally if you install an M1 Double Mega, your audio output lines for the FM chips are on little pins like you can sort of see here. Let me get the main board out of the way so we have a contrasting surface. You've got your little wiring pins here, and these attach to the output locations off of the 2612, which then goes through the rest of the filtering circuit. Well, because we're going to be using the M1 Mini Mega board in this case, these two wires will actually be getting soldered to the input lines on the M1 Mini Mega. Now what I'm actually ready to do is to go ahead and start doing some of the initial wiring. Now what I am going to do here is I'm actually going to wire off of the pads off of the M1 Mini Mega board first, and that's because the pitch on these pads is pretty close to each other. It's pretty small, whereas I've got a whole lot more room when I'm ready to solder those wires back down to the input lines off the PCB, off the main board. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do now, is I'm going to go ahead and wire up, or get some wires soldered off of these pads here off the M1 Mini Mega. Okay, so I've just completed the soldering of the initial input wires that I need. Of course, you can use any color combination you want, or you can use them all as the same color. It's really entirely up to you. I just happen to use the same colors that are in the initial instructions, which in this case is like this purple, this blue, green, yellow, and orange. The two additional wires that would normally be attached would be over here to the far sides, and that is for the input right and left off of the FM channel, or the FM synthesis chips. Because this installation is getting the YM double, or getting the M1 Double Mega installed, I will not be putting separate wires off of this that I'll run to the actual main board. Instead, the wires that come off of the M1 Double Mega for the output lines will actually be soldered onto these points here. Other wires that I'm going to solder onto are going to be my voltage input, because I got to have voltage to power the circuit, of course. There's also going to be two additional wires I'm going to solder on for the output right and left for the actual audio output channels. And then we also have technically 3 ground points. We've got a ground point here, another ground here, and another far ground over here. You don't have to use all of these ground points. They're really just put in place for your personal preference for however it might be easiest for you to route your wires. Some people might prefer to have a separate ground for each of the left and right audio outputs. So that's why Firebrand has provided us with the separate grounds for each of the output lines, plus a separate ground over here for the actual circuit itself. But the reality is all of these grounds are electrically connected. So honestly, what I will probably end up doing is obviously I'm going to use the ground over here for the board and my voltage, and then I'll use one of these 2 additional grounds to provide my separate ground point to the actual RCA jacks. So that's what I'm going to do now, is go ahead and get some additional wires soldered onto here for my power and ground. I had mentioned this at the beginning of the video, but I'm going to reiterate it again, that anytime I am putting in wiring for my power and ground, I almost always use thicker wire than what I use for my actual connection wire. So I'm going to use this as my ground. It's a little thicker, and then let's see, I've got this stuff here, this reddish colored. It's actually kind of a darker orange. That's also a lot thicker. I'm going to use this as my voltage input wire. Again, I always like to use thicker wire for my main voltage and ground to the circuit. As far as the wire to the actual RCA jacks, I haven't quite gotten that far yet. I've got a number of different wiring that I can use, but really you can use whatever you want as far as what you want to wire out to that. So that's what I'm going to do now, is I'm going to get these stripped and tinned and get them added onto this board now. Okay, that pretty much takes care of the main wires I need to get started. Again, I do still need to add an additional ground wire and my output wires for the actual RCA jacks, but I'll probably save that for the end. I should have enough room still to be able to work around everything to be able to attach those in place. And you'll see here in a second that where I particularly choose to get my power and ground is the reason why I've already soldered these 2 wires on, but we'll talk about that next. So I've been taking some measurements around here just to see. Now, what we're going to also need in order to power our M1 Mini Mega board here is we're going to need some power and ground. And there's actually 2 real convenient places nearby that are fairly straight across where you can get this. And the good thing is that, again, you can get your 5 volts from lots of different places on a board like this, but I try to always retrieve my voltage and try to keep the ground doesn't really matter as much, but at least not with a board like this. But I always try to retrieve the power from the same location as the device I might be replacing. In this case, it would be the amplifier chip located way over here. So in measuring all this, if you weren't aware, the Genesis actually has 2 voltage regulators right here. And they're each 5-volt voltage regulators. Now this is only on the original Model 1 units. Starting with like the VA7 and above, you only have just the 1 VR. But it turns out that VCC number 2, which is this one right here, is the one that provides the initial power for all of the audio subsystem stuff. And in addition to that, it also provides the power to the RF modulators. And we can prove this quite easily by simply taking one probe. I'm in continuity or diode, whichever. In my case, I like the beep. There's actually 2 different RF line points on these main boards. And because of that, we've got a set of 3 lines or 3 points right here completely unused. And we've got a power and a ground that we can get from that quite easily. So again, to check where this power, which one of these is power, I'm just going to put one end of the probe on the output line from the voltage regulator. But right here, that's my ground. That does nothing. And then right here, which is pin 1 on the secondary RF modulator, is, there we go, there's my positive 5, my 5 volts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the power wire, in this case, straight to this pin here. And then as far as ground goes, I could attach my ground to the secondary point or to pin 2 off of the RF modulator input, but it's kind of close in proximity to the power. And if you want to make, give yourself plenty of room and space to work with, you could actually attach it right off here, off of one of the ground points that's anchoring in the RF modulator. There's a whole bunch of those around. I'm going to have plenty of places to attach ground. So you might see that the RF modulator is removed in the rest of this video, but just keep in mind that that's not necessarily what I mean, you obviously don't have to do that. That's just in this particular case I'm going to be doing that. But any number of places where you can more easily reach ground is perfectly acceptable. So that's what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put the M1 Mini Mega in here and get it wired up. Now the M1 Mini Mega already comes with some double-sided foam tape on the back of it here, which is great, not a problem. That's to ensure that it'll stick quite firmly to any flat spot that you choose. However, one thing that some people don't do, but they should do, is you need to make sure that the spot you're going to attach something like this to is nice and clean. So what I'm going to do real quick is I'm just going to get some paper towel here, and I'm just going to use my IPA here, fairly high concentrated IPA. I think this is 99.9% electrical grade alcohol. And I'm going to rub and clean in the spot where I plan to attach this thing, because again, I don't want any leftover flux or any little solder beads or anything like that, or especially dust, to get in the way and prevent that double-sided foam pad from making good contact with the board. I want it to sit nice, flat, clean, and be well attached to the PCB. And then I'll use the dry side of this to rub it back down. Squeaky clean. I like that. Good. So now what I have done is, in preparation for installing the M1 Mini Mega amp here, I've already got the rest of my wires now soldered on that I'm going to need, such as my audio output wires, and I've gone ahead and essentially measured up and trimmed up and tinned up the power and ground wires that I will use for connecting this up. So now, since I've already previously cleaned off this section here where I'm going to install the M1 Mini Mega amp, I'm going to go ahead and now peel my paper backing off of the sticky pad and carefully get this thing placed where I need it to be. Alright, now I need to go ahead and get my power and ground wires soldered down. So let's get that taken care of. Power and ground are in place where we need them to go. And then you can see I've already got my audio output lines ready to go here as well. So now the next step we've got to do here is to shift gears a little bit to this side. Basically what we need to do is we need to start attaching these audio input lines down where the caps used to be. I'm going to start my way from the top down, and that means that I need to start with the blue wire first, actually, which in this case is actually the input from the 32X left audio. Yep, that's what this is. So this actually needs to eventually come out to the negative side of capacitor C42's location, which is right here. So this blue wire is going to be really, really short and only needs to come to about there. So I'm going to do my typical, where I actually cut my wire a tad longer, utilizing the other lead's position as my guide. Just like that. Okay, so I've got to, you know what, I'm going to cut these first to the lengths I'm going to roughly need, and then we'll go from there. I've got the ends of my wires cut to roughly the lengths I need them to, as well as stripped and tinned, ready to go. What I'm going to do now is apply some flux over the soldering points to make sure everything adheres where it needs to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the first wire in this case, which is actually the blue line, and then I'll proceed in order from there. So basically I'm going to start with my attachment point from capacitor C42 and work my way down. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip this over and trim up any stripped wire leads that may be a little too long on the back side. So yeah, the physical installation itself of the M1 Mini Mega is in place. At this point, what's really left to do is to attach my audio wire that I have coming off here to some RCA jacks or whatever output I decide I want to use. That will be the next part, is pretty much this finished up, where I've just got this tidied up and connected at that point. And then we'll test it out and make sure it works, and then it's all good to go.